Good evening, I'm Greer McGeary, President of Seahorse Victoria, and with me tonight is my guest, Dr. Tobi Evans. Welcome, Tobi.
Thank you for having me.
A doctor?
Yeah.
What sort of doctor role?
My PhD is in cultural studies, and I've always been really interested in gender for now kind of obvious reasons. When I was starting to think about what I wanted my PhD to be about, I noticed that a lot of the men around me seemed to be really struggling with things like feelings and, making friends and things like that. And I was like, what is going on? And then I was like, oh, okay. I discovered masculinity studies, and I was like, okay, there might be something going on there. So I started thinking about my PhD in terms of, masculinity and gender and how we can maybe think about masculinity in a way that is, has space for being caring and for being, communicating with people and things like that. But I was also like, okay, that's, an important part of masculinity, but another important part of it is where we get our ideas about masculinity, which is popular culture a lot of the time. So I decided to do my PhD on masculinity and violence in the Game of Thrones books and TV shows as a way to,
that's an interesting connection. In taking on those studies, how did that inform you of your own identity?
It was really great to learn about, queer theory, because I used a lot of queer theory to think about masculinity, and also I looked at masculinity in a very kind of broad and inclusive way. So, I looked at more normative masculinities, so, people who are assigned male at birth and grow up, as men and as cisgender, as well as, men who are disabled, as well as female masculinities and trans masculinities and gender fluid masculinities, all those kinds of things. And obviously being exposed to all of that in my studies, I was like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. And I remember reading Female Masculinity by Jack Halberstam, and I was like, okay, this is really interesting. It definitely awoke some things in me. And, I just learned more about, transness and queer theory. And I started, I realized firstly that I was very gay. And then a few years later, I realized I was trans as well.
Going back to the earliest memories of thinking there's something different about me compared to what people are trying to do for me and with me. What was that like? Or when did you find out about that?
I think I always felt different, and I always was different from people around me, but I don't think that, that can be boiled down to gender reasons. I grew up very poor. I grew up, very bookish. I'm an introvert, so I don't, and, I sometimes have social anxiety, so I don't sometimes do well with large groups of people like you might find in a classroom. And I also had, very different values to a lot of the people around me. I grew up in Queensland. And, from a very young age, I was like, I don't know if war is a good thing, but that, that kind of critical thinking is not necessarily fostered in that, environment. So, I was always very strange, but also for, I was a queer child, and that's, but I didn't know that, and that makes it hard to.
I've said in other conversations where I've sort of had an inkling of this from a toddler, but at the same time, you could never really put a name to it, or even through my teenage years, and also there's a degree of not wanting to deal with it as well.
Yeah.
So, so how were your parents in the way you were treated? Were you just brought up as a girl all the time, and you were expected to do girl things, or were you allowed to sort of be the tomboy, or be involved in whatever you like to be involved in?
I definitely wasn't a tomboy growing up, and I would describe myself as quite a feminine person, but a more non-binary man-shaped human, and I think that kind of adds a interesting kind of layer on it, because I am kind of a feminine, I'm very camp, and I think that it's easy to kind of confuse camp with femininity, especially if you don't know what camp is. So I
suppose there's a degree of femininity, being effeminate, which is not really being feminine or male. It's sort of just it's an exaggerated sense of something.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that I didn't really feel super restricted, as a kid, because you don't know about gender. You don't know to be I am getting praised for playing with a certain type of toy, and so your brain is just I like being praised, so I guess I'll play with this toy again, rather than being well, I really, thinking critically about it, because you don't have the tools when you're a kid.
What sort of reaction to you as a person at school? Was it particularly, say, primary school, or was it more in secondary school that you started to sort of notice differences?
I think actually for me, like in primary school and kind of early high school, my best friend was a gay, now man, then boy, and he was very clearly a gay boy growing up, and that obviously attracted, well, not obviously, but unfortunately attracted a lot of bullying and a lot of that kind of thing. And we were, we had people throw rocks at us, we had people throw food at us. And it wasn't at me, but it was, because I was friends with him, I was definitely exposed to that as well. And there, people were probably also like, maybe there's something going on with my gender, sexuality, whatever, too, because I was, always hanging out with the gay boys. But yeah, like, it was difficult, but, we also had a really great friendship. We're still friends today, which is awesome. And I had a really great group of like queer friends in high school. Again, I'm still friends with a lot of them today. So it was difficult, but, I had that kind of queer kinship as well.
Do you sort of feel, sort of talking about that relationship at school and association with a particular type of person, and just witnessing the bullying, that, do you think that sort of has an influence on the way you sort of pick and choose your subjects, or were you just sort of, as you said, booky person? So, or did you already have some idea of, the style of where you'd like to head with your studies?
I wouldn't say my thinking about my career or studies was particularly related to my gender. I remember when I was in high school, I wanted to be a film director, actually. And then I got as a bit older, I decided I wanted to be a writer. So I was always kind of doing subjects that I knew that I would enjoy. So I did, drama. I was in the drama academy, and I did, art, and I did like media studies and things like that. I had to do like design technology, which is like, woodworking things. And I was like, this is awful. And I had to do dance as well. And that was like the worst semester of my life ever, because I'm not super coordinated. But yeah, I wouldn't say I was really thinking about that in terms of what I felt like I had to do, because, I was always myself, and there was no changing that. Like, I wasn't going to suddenly be, great at maths or great at dancing, because that's just not the vibe.
Well, obviously it must have been all that influence in when you leave secondary school and you get into uni. What did you initially study before you went on to your PhD? So
I did my Bachelor of Fine Arts in Creative and Professional Writing at the Queensland University of Technology. And that was really fun. Like, I really enjoyed learning about the craft of writing, and I found out, unfortunately, I'm not a very good creative writer, which is an important thing to learn if you're doing a creative writing degree and you're surrounded by like brilliant authors. But I am a really good, writer in terms of, clarity and report writing, and obviously academic writing. Like, that is like chef's kiss. So that was great. And doing that degree, when you're studying literature, they're inevitably in these conversations about race and about gender and things like that. And when I did kind of, introduction to literary studies, and we did like a week on gender, I was like, this is really interesting, and kind of learned about that. And that led me to do honours, and I did a research project on masculinity and young adult fantasy fiction, which then of course led into the PhD on Game of Thrones. With
all of that, I'll use the term hanging out with the queer community, as it were, did you find yourself sort of dressing androgynously, or were you sort of just your flamboyant self?
I think it's evolved a lot over the long time since I started university in 2011 to now. But I was a very feminine presenting person for a long time, especially in my when I was studying my PhD and doing my bachelor's. Like, I wore a lot of like vintage dresses and things like that. But I think that when I look back on that, it was very costumey, and it was very camp. And I don't feel like the way I dress now is necessarily like real, and that was like fake. But I think that I'm just a very flamboyant person, and because I'm also a very camp person, I was like, well, I'm gonna wear this like wild goth outfit with like giant chunky boots because it's fabulous, and I would still wear that today. But I think like I've definitely I've realized that I could start wearing things like button-up shirts, and as I kind of started to think more about my own evolving gender identity, especially after I realized that, I was same-sex attracted and I started hanging out with queer people more, I was like, oh, okay, like I've got some options in terms of like, dressing more masculine. And then I was like, oh, I like this. This is really great. And then, my style kind of evolved, more masculine, but still, very, very fun and very, very camp.
So it sort of sounds like, that you've had a fairly consistent run of association from school through into university. Did you sort of at any point ever find resistance to you as a person because you were hanging out with that crowd?
Resistance to me as a person in what way?
Well, I suppose, there are times when, people sort of look at you and think, who do you think you are type thing, or, just not treating you as though you're an outsider all the time. Did that sort of come into any of that at all?
I was and wasn't an outsider, before I started, I guess, like presenting more visibly queer, which would have been in my like mid-20s. But I, on the surface would have appeared like a cisgender heterosexual woman for a long time. Like I had a male partner for a very long time. And I was bisexual, but obviously because I was feminine presenting, feminine queer people often struggle to be seen as queer. But I was an outsider in that, I'm a very open person and I'll tell people what I think. So, and, some people are always going to struggle with that kind of thing. I've struggled a bit in the workforce, like, especially the last few years after leaving academia and transitioning in terms of people using the right pronouns and, trying to gently suggest to people, maybe we don't make jokes about like bearded ladies. Maybe we don't, make kind of racist jokes, like that kind of thing, and try to be like, it's, that kind of thing. So I get some resistance there.
Was the decision to transition after you finished your uni studies, or was it happening while you were?
You don't really have a time to think about many things when you're doing a PhD, apart from lots of writing and editing and crying in your bathroom. That's a joke. There is some crying. But I think that, once I finished the PhD, I had time to just kind of be a person. And, in that kind of year one after I submitted it and was kind of doing the revisions, I had time to kind of, reflect on what I wanted from life, where I wanted to go and things like that. And one of my actually really good friends who I went to high school with actually came out as non-binary in that year. And I remember sitting down with them when I was visiting Melbourne, because I lived in Canberra at the time. And I was like, oh, so this like non-binary thing, like that, I'd love to hear more about that if you want to share it. Like, I want to support you as a friend. Like, what's with the they, them pronouns? Like, I'd love to, understand it and then like support you, as thoroughly as I can. And that friend very kindly, talked to me about what that meant for them. And I was like, oh, that sounds like me. Like, great. And I was like, oh, cool. So I went, I kind of realized I was non-binary and kind of eased into that. And then, of course, I moved to Melbourne and had the privilege of, suddenly being in a new place where no one knew me. So it's a very, difficult time to change where you're living, but also, have the benefit of being like, well, I'm a new person, going to try some new names, going to try some new pronouns, see what fits. And then we went into lockdown. So
yes, it sort of is a big challenge, lockdown. I was quite a prolific reader, and then I found it sitting at home in the unit. I didn't really want to do much reading because it was just sort of a pall of where are we going now, sort of thing. And it was very hard to pick up books. So I've got quite a few partly read books at home at the moment. Now, I didn't ask the question, but have you got siblings?
I do. I have a sister.
Making the decision that I'm moving to Melbourne and transitioning, what was the impact on your family?
So actually, I grew up in Queensland and then moved to Canberra to do my PhD and then moved to Melbourne. So I'd already, the move to Melbourne was like no difference for them, because they were like, we talk to you once a week on the phone, and like there's no change. But in terms of when I moved, from Queensland to Canberra, it was a really big change. And it was my first time living out of home as well. So, that's a very dramatic way to live out of home the first time. I feel like most people kind of maybe move like down the road and then they can be like, oh, Mom, I forgot to buy, rice and it's now I can't get to the shops, or, that kind of thing. Or I don't have a vacuum, can I borrow? Like, you can do that. But when you move into state, and, I haven't had family in Canberra or Melbourne, it's a very like, you're like, oh, okay, I have to like figure all of this adulting out very suddenly, but also, you know, how you have those relationships when you're not, you know, living with people or in the same state as them. And I've been very lucky that my parents are, you know, very happy with, like, you know, a weekly phone call. And my sister now has 2 small children, so we talk when we can.
Yeah, but what was their reaction to you saying, well, guess what, Mum and Dad?
Yeah, my sister's been fantastic. I couldn't ask for a better support. She's just been like, yep, love it. Just tell me what I can do to make you feel comfortable, which is like amazing. My dad's also been really great. I don't think that he, like, you know, necessarily understands all of it, but he's very like, if this is what makes you happy, love it, fully support it, here for it. My mum has been on a journey with it. She really struggled, and you know, she's struggled, you know, since I came out as a lesbian many years ago now. So, you know, that was difficult. And then, you know, obviously when I came out as non-binary, and then as, you know, transmasculine, that's been a struggle. And, you know, it really kind of came to a head at this kind of start of last year. I had a very difficult visit in Queensland, and I ended up not speaking to her for about 9 months. And that was really, really hard. But, you know, since then, I think she kind of realized that there was a lot going on, like, inside of her that might not have been about me, actually. And she has, you know, gone to see a psychologist, and she's done the really, really hard work of being like, okay, where is this reaction coming from? And what do I actually want out of my relationship with my son? And doing the awesome work to kind of get into a good place with that. So now our relationship is a lot better.
Oh, that's really encouraging to hear that, because, you know, talking of that, you know, parent-child relationship, you know, because in my case it's the other way around. I've had to out myself to my children, and, you know, I still get on very well with them. And that, in a recent conversation with my daughter, you know, she said, once I was the boss of her, and now I'm not. And that was really something that, as young parents, we made a conscious decision about independence and responsibility for that independence. And so even though there was sort of all those sort of interesting things that happen with seeing your kids go off and doing this or that, and you think, well, yeah, I mightn't like it, but it's not up to me to really do, you know, go and jump up and down about it. And I suppose I sort of expected the similar in return. You know, there were some difficult moments, but by and large, my family's been very accepting of where I am. But then I sort of play a little bit of a dual sense in certain aspects because of respect for certain people. You mentioned about employment's a bit of a difficulty. So where do you see your studies and PhD taking you for a career?
So I was talking to a friend recently about you know, employment and jobs and things like that, and he was like, so what are you like qualified to do? Like, what are you technically qualified for? And I was like, everything and nothing, because, you know, doing an interdisciplinary PhD like mine, like, you know, it touches on film and writing and gender and, you know, violence and, you know, culture and how we, like, you know, think about culture, and also, like, you know, there was work on disability. Like, there's so many things that, you know, I can do, but also, like, I'm not, like, I'm kind of a generalist and a specialist at the same time. So what I have been doing and what I really love doing is, like, diversity and inclusion focused work. So I've been working in local government for the last 18 months. First as a diversity project officer, and since then as an organisational development consultant, working on largely LGBTIQ and gender equality stuff, which is really, really fun. In
the workplace then, what you've been doing in recent times, you're finding that extremely supportive?
I think, you know, it depends on the people that I'm working with. There's a lot of kind of general support, but I think, you know, people often just, like, I'm the first trans person they've met ever, which is, you know, strange for me, but, you know, also, you know, strange for them. And they're, you know, very new to things like gender pronouns, and, you know, the idea that not everyone is cisgender. So, that's been, a challenge, but also like a wonderful thing because, I do a lot of education and training type of stuff. And, I taught for a long time when I was a lecturer and doing my PhD. So, I love teaching and I love training, and it's just my favorite thing ever. So it's nice to get to kind of know that I'm doing that both like actively in like delivering training, but also like kind of indirectly and just existing, like this in the world.
Because I think that's quite important. I know myself, while I'm now retired, but I've through circumstance had to sort of do physical work for the last 15, 20 years, and so that fluoro shirts and seal cap boots sort of don't necessarily don't mix with a lot of things, but it was easy to sort of just go along and talk about the things you did, because you don't talk about the clothes you wear when you talk about the things you do, unless it's very specific to the conversation. And so I'd talk about going to my Toastmaster club and doing judging at competition time and things like that. But I've been obviously involved in social support group for a long time, and so you might say, I'm going out with friends. But with social support, what have you done sort of outside of the work environment are you doing with social support?
So I've been really lucky in that as soon as I moved to Melbourne, I made some really, really good transmasculine friends. And that's been really instrumental in helping me find, organisations like The Shed, which is like a transmasculine focused, support group, as you know. And, just kind of figuring out what my options are, because I think that, unlike a lot of, ways of being in the world, like when you're queer, you don't necessarily you come from a queer family, and you don't necessarily have, institutions being like, oh, you are this type of person, here's some support resources for you. You're kind of like, this, and now what? And especially if you're like a transmasculine person, because there's not a lot of visibility for transmasculine people. And, now we've got fabulous people like Elliot Page, just, coming out there being both sexy and fabulous. And so people can kind of start to see it a bit more. But I was very lucky in that I happened to meet some great, trans men when I moved to Melbourne, and then got involved with The Shed. And now I'm a very vocal member of Book Club, which I'm also going to be kind of helping to run this year. But I think that having spaces like the Gender Diverse Book Club that The Shed runs has been really amazing, especially during lockdown, because I think that it can be hard as a queer person to feel connected to community generally, or at least I've found that. But I think that that when you're in lockdown, that is compounded a lot. So having things like Book Club, there's a space you can go and
the Zoom sort of did help sort of overcome some of the connection things, even if it's not ideal, at least to be able to see somebody's face and have a chat, even if it's rather clipped, or you see the little blue circle going around on the screen, to have that connection. The thing about social support, I think, is very important, is that allows you, one, to gain knowledge and acceptance from others, but they're learning from you as well, because they're meeting somebody who, you've been to uni, you've got a PhD, you do have employment, and so it provides an encouraging thing to do. In my case, when I sort of started to look, I went and joined a mainstream public speaking group, and it's been very well accepted. Even though I obviously stand out being 6 foot tall, and I don't change my voice because trying to make it a higher pitch sounds extremely artificial, but that's part of challenging yourself to work out. Yes, look, I can be accepted for who I am regardless of how I look. And that, social support's very important in that. So now that you've sort of, to a degree, becoming much more settled in yourself through those things that you've already described, do you have much sort of vision of where you might be in the next few years?
Well, I'd love to keep working on LGBTIQ inclusion, but diversity and inclusion more broadly, because obviously LGBTIQ people are also Aboriginal, have disabilities, come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So I think that doing really like intersectional kind of focus work is something that I really enjoy. So yeah, ideally kind of gender equality things, violence prevention things, LGBTIQ stuff is my favorite place. But I'm also finishing off my first book, which hopefully all the revisions are done now. So that should be hopefully coming out this year. So that's also another project.
Yeah. So I look forward to doing that. Obviously, you're not going to get much beyond that until you sort of get into each of those things. So,
yeah.
But is the book sort of more of an educational book, or is it more of a novel style book?
So it's based on my PhD research. So it is kind of focused on masculinity and violence, and how we can kind of reimagine masculinity and even violence in terms of, is it necessarily destructive? Can it be useful and productive? And what ways in which can it be maybe like an act of care and things like that. So it's definitely not a novel, because as I mentioned, I'm a terrible creative writer.
Writing up sort of textbooks, as in effect they are, having a certain degree of creativity in it sort of helps for its readability and understandability.
Yeah.
Dr. Tobi, it's been a pleasure to have a conversation with you today, and look forward to seeing your book when it comes out.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Greer McGeary, and my guest has been Dr. Tobi Evans. Thank you for watching Bent TV.